Hello and welcome to today's dialogue. Today we're going to continue to talk about Tom Matt. Yesterday I was calling him Tom Mate, and we're going to continue to talk about him and have a dialogue. And part of it is reacting to what he is saying about his abilities, the capacity he gained, as well as how he sees it and how it came about. And it's like reacting. And there's a lot of reaction videos now on YouTube, people having emotional reactions and sharing their thoughts. And I put the word react into an anagram website and it created other words. And one of them is trace. And so when we think about the word trace, and we look up the definition, it says find or discover by investigation. So we're sort of tracing what he is saying, and I'm drawing parallels to my own journey in order to reinforce it, in order to build more understanding, to sort of validate my own findings, not in terms of like trying to validate my identity or myself, but validate the process of discovering other abilities and capacities and then working towards using them and finding out what these capacities can bring to oneself and the world through that type of investigation. And like I said yesterday, I really appreciate his approach and attitude of being really excited about his gifts and exploring them, using them. And to me, in my journey, it hasn't been the same path as him in the way it came about and the way that he has been able to embody his gifts. But the thing that is similar is that there are gifts and they can be harnessed and embodied and they are meaningful and useful. And the other part he shares is how he can see that for himself very obviously because he's experiencing that. The usefulness, the meaningfulness, also really wondering about it and openly expressing how much he doesn't know and doesn't understand, but is building an understanding and may eventually have these understandings that answer the questions that come about through having these abilities and seeing things that he sees. And so that can happen where somebody wakes up with a gift the next day in their life, just out of the blue, or through a process like mine where I get a mental health diagnosis and slowly over the years start to salvage what it's showing me that I'm able to do, as well as regain or not some of the other functions that I had before. And the other word that is in the anagram for react is caret, as in C-A-R-E-T. Same letters as react. And a caret is a wedge-shaped mark made on written or printed matter to indicate a place where something is to be inserted, right? One of those little caret marks. So in a way, by talking about what he says and then putting a caret, I'm inserting what I see from what he's saying, whether it's something brand new, like a brand new insight that I've never had before, or relating something that I have experienced before, or drawing parallels that he has different abilities than I do, but the process of acquiring the ability and honing the ability might be different in terms of time and many other things. But the fact that it is possible is the underlying thing. So that's why I like these words better than like react, because a reaction just seems like so automatic, and like we think of reactions almost like this almost quote bad thing most of the time, like, oh, they reacted or they overreacted. And instead we're really tracing along and following along his intelligent process and bringing in ours and mine. And hopefully more people start to do that, because the thing is that there aren't very many, quote, role models for this, right? So I was talking about Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, somebody else I was also pronouncing the name wrong, sorry, and how he is using the humanities and trying to show that there's this 1% super humanities that humanities isn't exploring, right? But he doesn't necessarily share that he experiences these things, but he takes in reports through research of people who do. Now here, Tom Matt is someone who experiences these things and is joyfully exploring it, right? So it can be a process that's long or short to get to the point where you even can joyfully explore it. So that's what I'm really appreciating about him. And that is already changing a lot of my mental models around how I am approaching things. And changing is part of growing and learning, right? And I happen to be in a stage of my process that I'm moving towards embodying more so. And so he is showing me, just by watching him talk, how to, or ways to embody being like, yeah, I do have these abilities and this is what they are. And this is what they might be able to do to fit and support current mainstream structures. And this is how it might bring about and create new structures in the future, whatever that looks like. And I don't know what that is exactly either. And part of my process, and a lot of my process, is to say, I have no idea. To the point where I would say, like, when I say something, I literally forget. So I have to use technology and writing things down. Otherwise, I would probably just be kind of in nothingness. So, and that might be fine too. But I'm not going to do that right now. So what really also struck me about him, to continue with what we were talking about yesterday, is that he seems to be doing Gaiaence. And that's a word that I created, which is Gaia and Science. Gaiaence, which is how we can see scientifically and observe facts, truths, meaning, which is facts for ourselves based on relationships and movements and objects and people that we're experiencing in life, right? Generally, we experience the limited ego chatter, right? But if that is dismantled, then we start to have other perceptions, and they can be not completely scientific. Like, I actually had a vision or seeing into a process when I was in the shower, where I realized, like, the scientific method as it is, with hypothesis, null hypothesis, doing all these tests and like proving and replication, I sense that it's something that's embedded within our brain algorithms. It's not our only way. But what happened was somebody kind of discovered the scientific method and kind of wrote it out in steps and then used that as like, okay, this is how we do science. But it's actually something we can do in real time, in a flash, in our minds. And that's could be how a lot of hypotheses get formed, right? Like a question, like, and then you see that it can possibly fit into the scientific method and do it. But what I'm saying is, like, the scientific method is a slow version and a more methodical version as ways to test things through this externalized method of things that we may be able to ascertain as true just by looking at them, right? But we're kind of double checking. So now you could say, well, it's not scientific to think that we can see these things as facts and sort of know things just by looking at them and really observing holistically. But the thing is, if we were, say, for example, imagine a world where we're all able to do this and really see how things work and the facts as we're observing them, can't know everything at the same time. If we could all do that, it's not that we wouldn't need science. We would possibly need to all come together to really decide which science experiments we'd really, really want to do, because we would have infinite possibilities of the ones we could do all at the same time based on humans, however many humans walking through life, having these insights that are like Gaientific perceptions nearly moment to moment, right? So maybe a few people would decide to go off and do science about it. Now, that's in a way what's already happening, in that there's a small percentage of people that are literally scientists doing these experiments. But if we had Gaientific perception, our scientists would maybe be different people and doing different experiments that would obviously uplift humanity because and Gaia, because we'd be perceiving holistically, and we wouldn't be creating these like divided things that are externalizations of very limited and mechanical section of life, or like of human life, which we call, technology and things, which is mechanical and quote not life. But we could equally have technologies that are life. And I think Gaiaence is one of those technologies that we have within ourselves. And that's the way that I think is more fundamental to like Tom having the ability of what he calls Upsight, the ability to see holographic images outside of himself. And he makes it clear that they're not in the mind's eye. It's not hyperphantasia where you have very vivid imagery in the mind. And we'll get back to hyperphantasia, because I think it's interesting that his capacity that came about through this process is Upsight, which is seeing vivid images outside of himself, like holograms. And he had hyperphantasia to start, which is vivid imagery. And he said he worked in marketing, and that was an important part of working in marketing. So what's interesting for me is I have aphantasia, which means I literally see nothing in my mind. And I just came across a research paper that was, because what I did was I looked up a word for, well, what if you don't hear anything in your mind either? And it's called, I won't know how to pronounce it, but it's called anoralia. Let's pretend that's how you say it. Anoralia. So it's meaning you don't hear anything in your mind. And this paper is called anoralia. Can't say that. Good thing I don't have to have it in my mind because it's silent. The silent mind and its association with aphantasia. So this paper that I found is about how people with aphantasia who don't see images in their mind often also have no sound in their mind. And so that would be me. And why I think that's interesting is because I sense that the capacities that I'm embodying and practicing and harvesting are somewhat the opposite, or inverse, because I don't have strong imagery. I see maybe more vividly what is materially around me, and because of more attentional resources to that, sound outside me sounds louder. I have a sensitivity to sound, and that makes sense, because if part of my sound is in my head, then it's going to be partially blocking out the sound outside. But if I don't hear anything in my head, everything outside that is outside me sounds louder. And so this could also perhaps correlate to, from what I understand of Tom's process, it was with him more suddenly, right? Like he had a process of going on a drug bender, as he calls it in his the podcast I listened to, and then having a year of psychosis. He said his brain literally broke, and then it seems like his brain rewired, and he's been given this gift that he calls Upsight. Now, it kind of makes sense that if you're going to have a gift of seeing holographic images outside yourself, it's just going to be there, right? It's not going to like slowly, the hologram over 10 years finally appears, though that could be a process too. But for me, since I'm not like seeing anything outside myself other than what's outside myself, from what I can gather, and since I'm not hearing anything or seeing anything inside myself at all, the thing that I have is gleaning insights from moving through space and time as it is, which is limited by each moment passing, right? So I can't have like all of a sudden a million words in my consciousness at once. I'm observing life, and then an insight will happen that is literally at the speed, or maybe a little faster, of human speech. But when I receive that information, I don't hear it, and I don't see it either. Since I don't hear or see anything in my mind, I don't hear or see it when it comes to me, I literally write it down. There's like a slight impression on my consciousness, and I write it down. And if it makes sense, because if it were to clog up my consciousness and then start taking up brain space, or start echoing or repeating or building all these associations, I wouldn't necessarily be able to receive the next message or insight that comes from just kind of living in this space. And so, different gifts, different process, and different initial way of the brain operating to begin with, right? And it's my sense that there are many, many, many possible gifts. And now I'm sensing from just reading a bit of that paper that it could be dependent upon the way one's consciousness is operating on the inside in the first place, inside and outside. So that could provide a clue, just like they say, if somebody has these personality traits, they'd be better suited for this job in the economy. Well, there is a different economy likely going to emerge with different currency when we start to dialogue about and understand the way we are processing information and how that relates to the gifts that we might be able to harvest and harness and embody. And there's a lot more that I had insights around this, because just reading the comments and how many people are like, yeah, I have these types of experiences, or this is how my experience works, or this was my experience, but it was time limited, and then it scared me, and then it eventually went away. Now imagine a world where we're not afraid of these things, and we slowly cultivate them, like we might slowly change our diet, right? We slowly change the diet of our mind from our repetitive mind chatter that keeps us feeling safe, because it's a very limited amount of information. So we don't really have to have our brain metamorphose, right? But if we could take bits of this and slowly metamorphose over time, instead of decline and eventually become so stuck in our worldview that we're like the older generation. Imagine a world where that doesn't happen, because we're so fluid with our mind that it doesn't get stuck in this structure. There might be people with older bodies, and that already happens. There are some people who are older who have very young minds, and I've met some. So yeah, I see that Tom, in my vernacular, is a Gaiaentist. He's looking at things through his living process and how he's experiencing things and his gifts and what he's seeing and perceiving that maybe other people aren't. And it doesn't require a super apparently rare gift in order to be a Gaiaentist. This is more of a process of being interested in one's process, and how being interested in one's process can start to change the fundamentals of the process such that the brain really starts to flower. And, going through a crisis and a psychosis is one of those ways, because it really disables and disassembles all those mental models that were just really stuck there. And it does give an opportunity for something to rewire. But that's not the way we look at it, right? So I don't think Tom was diagnosed with a mental illness, because his psychosis was induced by going on a drug bender, right? So when you know the cause, and I think that's a non-organic cause, as they call it, because it's from the outside, then people kind of leave you alone, and they're like, oh, well, you just gotta fix your addiction, right? Which is also now called pretty much a mental illness to have an addiction. But what I'm trying to say is, from what I can hear from his story, he was in an apartment on an island near the Bermuda Triangle, or on the shore near the Bermuda Triangle area for a year, writing out all this stuff and putting it all over the walls of the apartment. And what I'm saying is he was left alone. Whereas, say somebody had a non-volitional psychosis happen, generally people gather them up and cart them off to a ward, and then that type of work and remodeling of the brain can't happen because the tranquilizers come in. right? So this is where he had an advantage, it seems. He also had probably the resources to be able to quarantine himself in order to be able to do that. And I think there's a lot of value to that. If we lived in a world where it wasn't so scary, I think a lot of people would say, hey, I'm on this like mental health. It's not even mental health. It's like rewiring my brain sabbatical for a year where I'm studying, I'm doing Gaiaence. I'm taking the messages that are coming to me because hopefully in the future it can happen more organically and people don't necessarily need to use all these substances in order to, like, say, alcohol and drugs, in order to have a breakdown and an addiction. That if we could stay with what that process is starting without continuing to take this stuff and dwindle our resources, then we'd probably learn and rewire our brain. So the initial process that leads to that, I think, is natural. But the trouble is that we get stuck at that, okay, well, these substances are calming the ego, but we don't learn from what that calmed ego is trying to say. And maybe with some of the substances that suppress the brain in some ways, that's hard to do. But apparently it looks like it can be done because this man, Tom, came through it with something more. So that is the very, very rare part. And how this extrapolates for me to re-uncovery is that, just like I talked about how somebody delineated the scientific method as a way to write out the steps and really slow it down to study things really outside of ourselves, the Gaientific method is a way to study inside ourselves, and then re-uncovery is a system to put these discoveries into different stages in order to support this rewiring of the brain, this flowering of the brain, this metamorphosing of the brain. So when I talked about Tom and how it seems like his process was fast, like he went through this addiction and psychosis and then came out with this gift, which I'll have to read more about to learn the specifics. Like for me, I've been going through this for many years, and it's like this slow process, which could be because of the way my brain started in the beginning and the gift that it is that I'm flowering, right? So it's like the difference between, say, becoming a marathon runner and then running marathons every day, and somebody, there are people who have a head injury and then wake up the next day and they can play the piano like they never could before, like a professional, right? So there are these things, and I sense there are mechanisms for that where that was part of our storyline to begin with, but by doing what we should do according to our education and upbringing, we ended up doing whatever it is we do as a career. Then somebody gets hit on the head and they wake up and they play the piano because they literally go to the parallel world where they were practicing piano the whole time. But it's the same thing, right? Like, it's a possibility thing. And that's why when he talks about Upsight and, seeing these things and wondering if anyone else sees them, if he can prove them, to me, if I look at the elements of what he is seeing in Upsight, I would say he's seeing possibilities. Now, there are more things to possibilities than what he's seeing. And if somehow every person could be trained with this Upsight that he talks about, they might see something different, or they might see something the same. And he actually wants to do experiments about that by meeting up with somebody who also has Upsight to see if they see the same thing. So I'll be curious to know about that. And you could even say, well, they are seeing the same thing. They're seeing possibilities. Like, that's sort of the fundamental thing. And even when I say that I sense and experience language, which I don't actually see it or hear it, but I write it down, like I just get it. I just get the message and I write it down. That is also a possibility. What just happened was possible. And I made it possible by writing it down. And so for me, I think my my ability and gift is maybe a little bit more provable, because I'm proving it on a daily basis by just like writing things down that I don't know where they came from. Though, I have a sense that I know I don't know where they came from, but in a sense I do know, because I know I don't know. And by knowing I don't know, and by not knowing, I can know these things. And that's part of not imagining them, or not allowing them to conceptualize in my brain. And I think there's space for all possibilities. So I'm talking about this and sort of juxtaposing his capacity to mine to show that the processes by which it can come about have infinite possibilities, and what the gifts of the process are also infinite possibilities. And that's something that happens, like, and has happened for me in these experiences in the past, is I've had different abilities, like, for example, mind reading, parallel realities, remote viewing, and I still can remote view sometimes. But those aren't the ones that became the thing that I've practiced, and embodied. But they just as easily could have, if after my very first experience, maybe if I would have been able to integrate and process it properly, maybe I would have just ended up with one of those gifts and not the one that I have by this sort of slow, more maybe methodical process that I have. So again, about his approach, I like that he is uncertain, he's curious, he's making, I call them hypotheses, not hypotheses, because hypotheses are about the scientific method. Hypotheses are like, you kind of know this already, and then you're kind of looking for the proof. Like, you know this living experientially, and then you're looking for the proof. So, like, imagine if you could see, there was just something I watched on YouTube. They discovered nitroplasts, which are nitrogen fixing organelles in some like bacteria or something. Now imagine if you as a person could see those. You could say, hey, there's these nitrogen fixing bacteria. You can't see the organelle, but I can. Then they would do the scientific method to prove it, right? Now that's just an example. I can actually sometimes see possible biological processes probably because of my background in biology. So if I had an insight about a process, I'll give you an example. And I wrote it down to share later, so I might talk about it more. But at some point in the conversation, they were talking about free will. Now, I don't know much about that per se, but sometimes things come to me. And the idea that came to me was, yeah, we have free will, but it's on a leash. Meaning, like, a person can keep taking steps and thinking they're doing free will towards a certain point, but then all of a sudden they hit a wall and they get like an illness diagnosis, or something happens, right? And they don't have free will anymore. So it's on a leash. Now, you can kind of visualize that somebody's on a leash with their free will and like slowly going towards the edge of the circle where the leash finally snaps them back. And now a bunch of the steps they took in free will, apparently, they've actually had to backtrack. So was that even free will? Not really. That's easy enough to visualize. But the process that I saw was, I will say, imagine there is a system in the body called the fascia system, and they're starting to study it more. And I've had my own experiences of the fascia system, where when I'm in altered states of consciousness, people that I know will literally tell me, you look taller. And for me, I feel like it's because with the change, the metamorphosis into trans consciousness, which is this probably more like right brain holistic form of consciousness, in order to explore that, changes the body and it relaxes the fascia. And the fascia, it eats like water and hydrates, and if that loosens up, you can imagine that you can become a little bit taller by being a bit more straight, and also being in that, what I call the adjacent light body consciousness, like you're naturally more in a good posture because you're yourself. You haven't been weighed down by gravity and thought over that period of time, And so now imagine there is like a little spot at the base of the tailbone, and that's where the leash attaches. Now, if you imagine this myofascial system as like a mesh of fibers, and as the person pulls on their leash with free will, it twists. It twists. And as it twists, slowly these fibers become less fluid. And it's sort of like, I don't know if you've seen, there's probably different examples of this, but if you've seen where you have like say a wire thing that protects your luggage from being stolen while you're traveling, if you're backpacking. And then you as you fold it up to put it away, it's now in a very much smaller space. Now that's probably not the best. There's probably better visualizations of that as real world examples, but I can't think of one. But as you twist, it's slowly making you like stiffer, and this is if you're going in the wrong direction with your apparent free will. So the wrong direction, you can't really go the wrong direction because there's a mechanism that will eventually stop you in your tracks, because it's winding you up, and it's making you eventually like not be able to stop. And actually, I saw an example of this on YouTube, or I wasn't looking for an example of this, but I opened YouTube, and now they have, some videos that are in portrait mode, and they're shorts, right? They have a lot more short videos, and I don't click on many of them at all. But there was one, and it was, I don't know what country it was from, but it said it was about catatonic schizophrenia. And there was a man laying there, stuck, and he even has his hands up, not rested by his side, but like up above and just out to the side of his body. And it's almost like a dead person laying there, but he's alive. And to me, I saw that after, or maybe before, I can't remember, I had this visualization, which I can kind of see it, but it's very faint. And I can recall it again. So I don't have like 100% aphantasia. But I have it just to the point maybe where it's useful for the gifts that I'm developing and that I have. But I could see how that person could end up like that by this twisting to the point of the myofascia. Metaphorically, literally, I don't know. To the point where they're stuck. Like they're stuck with the fascia. And the fascia surrounds the muscles, right? So not just about stiff muscles, but it's about becoming locked in this web of this sheath that covers everything in our body, all the cells. And so that's where I can kind of visualize-ish something that could be a biological-ish process